Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dancing into Brain Health podcast. I am your host, Magda Kaczmarska. How do we perceive beauty? How can engaging in art and the pleasure we elicit from it help us make sense and meaning and inspire us towards action in our daily lives? Can the experience of pleasure and beauty through the arts strengthen our health? Our guest on the Dancing into Brain Health podcast today is Dr. Edward Bessel, a neuroscientist who uses behavior, brain imaging, and computation to study the psychological and neural basis of aesthetic experiences, creative insight, and curiosity. We discuss how neuroaesthetic research is unraveling the way the brain responds to art, beauty, and creativity, and how these findings can inform future practices to improve brain health and well-being across our life. Dr. Edward Bessel is the Eugene Surowitz Assistant Professor of Computational Cognitive Neuroscience in the Department of Psychology at the City College of New York. His research group, the Visual Neuroaesthetics Lab, uses behavior, brain imaging, and computation to study the psychological and neural basis of aesthetic experiences, creative insight, and curiosity. He received his bachelor's from Johns Hopkins and a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Southern California. Before coming to City College of New York, Dr. Bessel was a senior research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt, Germany, and was formerly co-director of the New York University Art Lab. He's the Secretary General of the International Association of Empirical Aesthetics and an editorial board reviewer for the Journal of Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. Welcome, Dr. Bessel. I'm extremely excited and honored for this conversation.
Great. Thanks. Hi, Magda. Glad to be here.
And might I call you Ed?
Sure.
Thank you. So in preparing for this, I was reflecting that I think we met for the first time about a year ago at the United Nations Healing Arts Week in New York. And I'm really grateful to you for welcoming my geekiness and enthusiasm and connecting. But I've seen since that time had the incredible pleasure of learning a little bit more about your work. And I will say that every single time that we speak, I'm more and more in awe of you and more aware of just how much there is to learn in this field. So it's incredibly complex and applies these really brilliant models to understanding some of these universal, but equally universally mystifying concepts like beauty and curiosity and pleasure. So I'm humbled, delighted to speak with you today, and for our listeners to have a chance to meet you and to learn about your work and this really incredible field of neuroaesthetics in general. So as we start, I'm for myself, but also for our listeners, I wonder if we could learn a little bit about your journey. How did you get interested in the connection of arts and the brain? And how did you come into doing the work that you do today?
Sure. So, as an undergraduate, I had started out with an interest in pre-med and was taking biology courses and a bunch of other stuff. But I took some courses in cognitive science. I wasn't interested in being a straight-up pre-med major. Even after taking some courses in cognitive science, I still don't know that I knew exactly what it was, but I was fascinated by it. I'd always been fascinated as a kid by kind of pop science ideas around the brain. And I got interested in this idea of understanding what is the structure of knowledge. How is knowledge structured in the brain? So when I was making decisions about what to do next, I realized I didn't want to be a doctor. I really wanted to help create new knowledge. And I looked around for graduate programs where I felt I could really look at how it is that knowledge is structured in the brain. And that led me towards neuroscience programs and specifically to vision, because at the time, at least, vision was the sense where we knew the most about how the brain structured information. So I ended up in a vision lab. My PhD advisor was a person named Irving Biederman at University of Southern California. And pretty much right after starting there, we were talking about his ideas and theories around how it is that the brain helps us recognize what it is that we're looking at. But we realized that while we had some theories for that, we had very little idea of how it is then that people get pleasure from looking at visual images. So why is it that you can look at a beautiful sunset and find it pleasing, or even obviously moving beyond the realm of images per se, but actual visual experiences? Why is it that I can see that a table is not just a table, but it's a beautiful table, or that a bicycle is a ugly bicycle, or that a street scene is appealing or not appealing, right? So these links between the act of visual perception and then the emotional and affective qualities we take from them were really not very well understood. So we started doing some experiments on that, and that continued in my postdoc work. But an interesting thing happened there, which is that I started chatting some. We started with my postdoc advisor, Nava Rubin at New York University. We started chatting some with a woman named Gabrielle Starr, who is an English, her background is in 18th century aesthetics in the context of like an English department. And so she was looking at this idea of aesthetics and trying to understand it through the lens of Kant and more classical philosophers. And I was talking about visually induced pleasure. And we kind of wondered, are we talking about the same thing or not? So we put together a class where we tried to bridge some of these topics from neuroscience and vision science into philosophical aesthetics, and then some of the more recent work that had been coming out in this developing area of empirical aesthetics. And that really, I think, working with her kind of launched an interest in understanding is what happens when we look at a beautiful sunset, the same as what happens when we look at art, and has really propelled forward a lot of the questions that I've looked at since.
It's brilliant, and it's fascinating to me that something as simple as looking at a sunset is actually magnificently complex to understand. And I realize that you've been incredibly prolific in your work. And so in trying to prepare for our conversation today, I realized there's no way that we'll be able to cover all of your work. But I thought we might begin by introducing neuroaesthetics. So you have started to, in sharing a bit about your journey, you've started to explain what it actually is. But might we maybe start by defining what neuroaesthetics actually is? Or maybe breaking it down into what aesthetics is and then how is neuroaesthetics similar or perhaps different from it?
Yeah, so I think I would say that neuroaesthetics is interested in understanding the psychological and neuroscientific basis of moving experiences or positive experiences that we have with various sensory experiences. So, for example, when you find something beautiful or when you find that something is moving, and of course, we often focus on those more positive directions, but of course, there's the negative pole when you find something not beautiful or find something ugly or find something confusing. And then I would also highlight that while much of the work in neuroaesthetics focuses on the arts, so understanding how it is that a person might get a sense of aesthetic appreciation from a visual artwork or from a dance performance or from music, I like to emphasize that I think we need to understand this in the context of our responses to non-art stimuli, to things like sunsets or to objects. We can't presuppose that there's something different about those two. I think we need to start with the idea that we bring the same brain and the same processes to our evaluations of dance versus to bodies that are just moving, or to paint renderings of a sunset versus a real sunset, etc. And then, of course, we can ask the more interesting or difficult questions of whether or not there's something different that happens when something is art or not. So I think that would be the kind of main piece. I guess then there's a few additions there. So much of the people working in the field of neuroaesthetics are focused on understanding what happens in the mind of the perceiver who is looking at or listening to art. But of course, we're also interested in understanding the creative production of artwork or of aesthetic products. And then lastly, I would say that there is really this applied piece where if we can imagine that we had an understanding, or when we gain understanding about the neural and psychological basis of these moments, how then can we apply that to improve health and well-being?
Yeah, I want to jump right into a question, but I'm going to try to restrain myself and come back to it because you mentioned so much of the words that you mentioned, whether perceiving whether something's beautiful or whether it moves us or whether it's ugly. It strikes me that the initial thought that I have is that that's an affective process. It's a feeling or an emotional process, but I'm curious how that might relate to other mechanisms. So maybe I can kind of tie it into my initial question, which was you mentioned that you're looking at research of perception, right? And so I'm curious, how can we unpack that a little bit? Would we say that perception is really just the physical process of seeing, or does it involve other mechanisms? So I guess maybe does it involve purely affective or emotional mechanisms in the brain, or are there perhaps cognitive or other mechanisms that get amplified when we perceive? What exactly is
Mhm.
perception in the brain?
Yeah. So these are interesting questions, and I would say that there's even some aspects of this that we don't have great answers for. So, for example, what is the boundary between perception and cognition is
Hmm.
a tricky one. I think I come more from the perspective that there's kind of a bit of a continuum between perception and cognition. So clearly, there's aspects of perception that really are about analyzing and understanding the features of what you're looking at. Where is their contrast? Where is their color? Where is their contour? How do those adhere together? So, in kind of the classical view of perception, we might break down, if we can restrict ourselves to talking about vision, there's early perceptual processes that help us identify the things I've just mentioned: luminance, contrast, color, the presence of oriented information at specific points in our visual field. And then there's a process called mid-level vision that is generally characterized as the stitching of those things together to help us understand things like the presence of surfaces or of depth, that, these contours form the edge of an object, and that or of a surface that is in front of another surface. And then in high level vision, we're taking those kind of two-dimensional or kind of two-dimensional plus, in the words of Marr, kind of 2.5 dimensional representations, and we are stitching them together to understand what it is that we're looking at. So, oh, that's a couch, that's a cup, this is a kitchen, I'm looking at a mountain, right? So that mapping onto of specific semantic concepts.
Mm.
Now, the story I've just told you is a very bottom-up story, that perception starts with light striking the retina and processing through these various stages of the visual system that extract increasingly more abstract hierarchical representations. And I think that is one way of understanding perception, but more recently, there's been a bigger push, and it's always been known that perception is not just bottom-up, it is also top-down. But I think that we haven't necessarily had as many ideas and theories to frame that. And more recently, in cognitive neuroscience, there's been a big push to look at perception from the context of what's called predictive processing.
Mm.
And the idea there is that when we perceive, it's not just this one-way street of the world being parceled out by us and understood, but in fact, we have an internal model in our head
Hmm.
of what we expect the world to be based upon our past experience and based upon the last moments of my conscious awareness. I have an expectation for what I should see if I were to open my eyes now, or if I were to turn my head to the right, or if I were to walk into my kitchen.
Mm.
And so perception is actually, in this framework, the process of comparing the physical input to my internal model. And so what is really emphasized is not the primary construction itself, but this comparison and the identification of places where my predictive model is wrong in some way or not detailed enough. And that really drives my attention and drives the signals that really get processed and passed through my brain. And so the last thing I'll say there is, I think it should be clear from what I've described that this multi-stage process is taking visual input, comparing it to our predictive model at multiple levels, and we are extracting meaning and understanding from that. And
Hmm.
so, again, the border between purely just kind of like a perceptual, like getting the picture inside your head, versus then actually understanding what it is there is no clear border there. So perception includes the act of making meaning.
Yeah, and I'm curious, and maybe this is a gross oversimplification, but when you were speaking about the predictive or kind of the anticipation of what we expect to see, I think about that test that visual test that we might have all seen as children, where there's an image, and if you look at it one way, it looks like a young woman, and if you look at it another way, it looks like a man, older woman. And I'm curious, is
Yes.
that an experience of that in action, of that predictive processing?
Yes, I think so. So that would be considered an example of an ambiguous stimulus, and that is a case where my perception of it is really changed. It's an obvious case of how top-down information influences what we're seeing. The bottom-up stimulus is not changing, but we have two very different percepts of what it is that we're looking at, and can even flip in between them. And so it's clear at that point that there's some point in our brain where we have a representation of one way of seeing it and a representation of the other way of seeing it, and those two are kind of competing with each other.
Yeah.
And when one of them is kind of favored and winning, then it is exerting influence on the lower levels of our perceptual system to really convincingly make us organize the image in that way versus in the other ways. It really is the case that we are in this kind of bistable state where we can kind of see one or the other, but can't really see both.
As you're thinking and you're speaking about meaning making arising out of these visual processes and these perceptive processes, this is something that we've been talking a lot about on the podcast. Recently, we spoke with somebody who's living with dementia, and he speaks about how you know the the diagnosis kind of strips an individual of a sense of meaning and purpose, and being able to find a new sense of meaning is something that he finds is really transformative, and almost is necessitates kind of being able to think about next steps and not being stuck in that sense of, now I have a diagnosis and what next. Being able to find that definition of what next helps create meaning and purpose. And for him, it was actually through creative processes and through arts and expression. I'm curious if we might maybe come back to that concept of meaning making and bring it back to one concept, specifically beauty. And I know, so it's a positive affect, a positively effective process. How do we arrive at a perception of beauty in the brain? Like, how would we define it? And would you say that beauty is the same as awe?
Yeah. So for the first question, I think so in my lab, we very much take what I refer to as an interactionist perspective. So what I mean by that is that, when you're trying to understand how a person aesthetically evaluates an object, there's an object out there in the world, and then there's the person who is perceiving it, but then there's the interaction between that person and the object. And I think that, really the magic lives in this interaction.
Mm,
And what the consequences of that are several, one of which is that I really don't think that beauty is out there. I don't think that beauty is a property of an object. So I actually wouldn't even necessarily talk about the perception of beauty, because that makes it sound like beauty is a physical thing that
mm,
exists in the world. I really do think that, beauty, and actually in my lab, we tend not to use the word beauty as much, largely because most of our participants in our lab, I think if you ask them to rate the beauty of an object, they think about kind of like the commonly agreed upon judgments of classical Greek sculptures or the Mona Lisa. Whereas what we really are trying to get at is the subjective feeling that they're
mhm,
having. And so we tend to talk about, aesthetic appeal or being moved is often what we ask people. Do you find this moving? Sometimes we'll ask, do you like it? Do you find it beautiful? And, there are groups who are, and some important questions trying to distinguish between these different things, including, for example, between beauty and awe, which I can come back to in a minute.
mm,
But often if we're, in my lab, much of the work we've been doing is kind of trying to understand the basic outlines of these processes.
mhm,
And so for that purpose, the difference between liking versus beauty versus being moved is kind of less important than trying to capture the common element of them, which is this kind of positive affective response we have to perceptual experiences.
mhm,
So I think, for me, it's really important that we be able to step inside the brain of the beholder and understand how it is that a particular object or experience, like watching a dance performance, relates to our internal models. So I described earlier this idea of predictive processing. And so if you think about the process of perception as being about identifying parts of the world that we are uncertain about, that don't match our predictive model,
mhm,
then I think that really triggers basically interest or curiosity in us, where we then attempt to kind of make sense of something, right? And sometimes that can be like, in a big arc where we kind of like we go down a rabbit hole or really spend some time trying to figure something out. That might be the case with art or with a more complex piece of performance. But then even in our everyday life, when we're just looking around at things and we notice something on the street, we may have an instantaneous split second where we look at something and then our brain is trying to figure out what it is and trying to map meaning onto it, right, in this top-down way. And then when we're able to do that, we actually get some pleasure from that act of improving our understanding. And so I think that, basically one of the key brain mechanisms that is tapped into when we find something aesthetically appealing is what I call pleasure from understanding. So this idea that we can get rewarding, pleasing, we can get pleasure and reward from many different sources. One of the sources that is well studied is like reinforcement, right? The fact that over repeated exposures to money, you come to understand that money is positively valued. Or, the same can be true for certain types of foods. Or if you think of Pavlov's classic experiment of ringing a bell and that becomes associated with food, right? So these are reinforced associations. But I think that there's another pathway to reward, which is through this mechanism of uncertainty reduction, of kind of like having aha moments, big and small, right? Of making sense. And so I think that we fundamentally get pleasure from the act of improving our world model of making sense, and that this operates both at the lower levels of sensory processing, what exactly is the form of what I'm looking at, as well as at higher levels of processing. What does it mean? What is it supposed to be? What was intended by the artist? Or how does it relate to me? What meaning do I attach to it?
Yeah.
And so I think that then all of these kind of signals from our act of perception that give us these kind of like aha moments of uncertainty reduction, that those really form kind of like the elemental stuff of affect and are kind of pooled together to kind of give us a sense of like, ooh, wow, I really find this beautiful, or this really moved me. So it's really about this act of kind of perception meeting with our internal models, and it's about kind of like the fit between them that kind of really gives us a sense of beauty. And I mean, if any of your audience members have read much philosophy, in some ways it sounds very similar even to what Kant or like many other people have said about beauty, that it really is about this kind of like resonance between the world and our internal models.
I love that resonance. I use the word a lot of relationality, that everything that we perceive is in relationship with other individuals in our environment. And it sounds like really you're shining a light and unpacking the magic of our perception and that exchange, really, that is a relationship, which I think is really beautiful, right? Not just in relationship with individuals, which I think we can all understand obviously can be complicated, but can also be incredibly rewarding. And we know social connection is incredibly powerful for our brain health, our well-being, but also this understanding that relational exchange can also happen with objects or our environment, and that it can be just as equally, whether that's a natural environment or one that's been created by others, that can be equally rewarding, satisfying, and not just purely from an effective way, but potentially from a motivational way, that we're in eliciting pleasure that's helping us. I love that phrasing, uncertainty reduction. I like that. I'm gonna try to take or the aha moment, which it's almost, to me, sounds like a reward for the curiosity, right? That the more that I am
Yeah.
curious, that I am willing to look around and perceive, not just kind of go through life without perception and awareness and being present, but by allowing myself to be present and aware of my surroundings, that I might then elicit something that helps me understand myself and my relationship to the universe or the world or that object, and that
Mm.
ends up being this positive rewarding loop that ends up supporting my health and well-being, as well as my connection to my surroundings.
Yeah, I think that's great. And actually, so you mentioned the idea of a motivation, and I really do think that kind of what I'm describing, this idea of pleasure from understanding, which I don't necessarily think explains everything about our aesthetic judgments and our aesthetic experiences, but I think it's a really key brain mechanism, and it's a key brain mechanism that operates not just in the realm of aesthetics, but also in the realm of curiosity and in inspiration and other places. I think that this really is basically a motivational signal. It's a motivational signal that helps guide us towards learning about stuff on the edge of what we know,
Mm.
right? So we don't know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know, in terms of the grand scheme of what there is to know. And so, for in the language of kind of like learn like computer science learning algorithms, right? The brain is a self-supervised learner, meaning that we often we have to figure out ourselves what kinds of things out there we should seek out and learn. And of course, it is the case that in the context of most human societies, we also have teachers and things like that tell us. But in terms of kind of like our intrinsic motivation, I think that this is really an intrinsic motivational signal that helps us guide us towards things on the edge of our own field of knowledge. And so, there are a number of theories in kind of the literature on empirical aesthetics. A really big one out there is this called processing fluency. And the idea there is that
Mm.
we get pleasure from things that are easeful, from things that actually match our existing perceptions or our existing world models. So things that are typical, things that are fluent in that sense to us, that make sense. But I think that that's not enough.
Mm.
If we only ever went with things that felt easeful or that matched our current world model, then we wouldn't really ever learn anything, and we would never seek out challenge. And
Mhm.
clearly, people do seek out challenge. And so I think that you need this other component that makes it clear why and how it is that people do seek these things out. The types of models that I like, that kind of my research falls into, is maybe what you might call more of a learning theory. And to kind of formalize that a bit more, if you think about your world model and the stuff that if I might be able to then to define a zone of learning, which is kind of on the edge of what you know.
Mhm.
And this relates to ideas in learning theory as well, right? The idea that there's kind of like a zone of proximal development. And so the idea is similar here, that there's basically a zone that is on the edge of what you know, that if you were to engage with it, you could potentially have the possibility of improving
Yeah.
your world model, right?
Yeah.
I think that this motivational drive, as I said, is really kind of pushing us to understand things on the edge of what we know. And so that helps us manage this balance between things that are familiar and match our world model versus kind of like going a little bit beyond that. And I think that the key there is that something which is novel, but so novel as to be kind of like completely unrelatable to what we know, doesn't even really register for us. And we can't make sense of it. We can't parse it. But it's these things that are kind of like in this nearby zone of near to what we know, in this kind of zone of learning, that I think are really where we can make some progress. And I think that, and one of my big interests is trying to understand and test these theories to see if it is the case that we can show that aesthetic appeal really is guiding us towards this zone and
Mhm.
providing this type of learning signal, guiding us to explore things on the edge of what we know.
I'm fascinated, and thank you so much for sharing this model or this mechanism, because it's something that we see, that I perceive, and that we perceive in our work with people living with dementia, or actually really with any population through dance. And I know that a lot of your work is around visual aesthetic experience, but I think when it relates to this mechanism of, you know, being on the edge of what you know, but still tethered or secure enough on something that's grounded and rooted in experience and
Sure,
familiarity, that then you are more willing to engage with something that's unknown. To me, a language I use is that it takes a lot of courage and risk to go into something that's unknown, and
sure,
so and that challenge, as we know, is fabulous. That novelty and challenge, and that positive stress is really good for our brain. But if we have too much, then it pushes us into really not being as much of a rewarding experience, and then we're more averse to it, less likely to engage. And so it almost
sure.
serves in the exact opposites. I realized that you were mentioning initially about how can we curate these intrinsic engagements, but I also think of as somebody who works in this space, how can I be aware of this and mindful of it so that I can facilitate an experience that is conducive to that edge of the known, right? So how do you look at a community or an individual and identify where exactly is that edge, and how much are we hanging over the edge into the unknown? And
Yeah,
how can
yeah,
we
most
guide
definitely.
individuals into overcoming and then having a satisfying experience and then being motivated to continue? we've definitely seen that. We've even heard people mention it. And I love that you've just offered a beautiful neuroaesthetic mechanism that helps tether it into something beyond just this anecdotal experience.
Mhm, mhm. I think you're exactly right there. I do think that the mechanism I'm describing plays a key role in learning, and that if we can understand more about it, it could really help us kind of craft and understand how to tap into a person's own intrinsic, mechanisms to help them learn better and be more interested and motivated. And what I'm describing is, first of all, it's not necessarily a new idea. I mean, various forms of this have been around a long time, and you see echoes of it in education theory. You see echoes of it in creativity. So people, or in, for example, people talk about flow, where flow is kind of, these moments where your ability is matched to the task, right? And you can imagine that's a state where you are kind of surfing on that edge a bit. If things get too far into the familiar, then they start to become boring. And if they get too far into the unknown, then they start to get, challenging or difficult, and you can fall out of that flow state. So yeah, I think there's a lot of relationships there.
I'm curious. We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but a lot of, for myself, being part of the Global Brain Health Institute, and I know also you and I in some of our conversations outside of this, we've spoken about how this understanding might also be applied in to support health and well-being. Or for me, I'm specifically interested in brain health. And you've touched on it a little bit, but I wonder if you might offer some of the ways that you're thinking about this understanding of this relationality between perception and aesthetic experience, and pleasure from understanding how we might be able to apply it, or how you might already have been applying it in therapeutic settings. And that therapy being either something that we apply very intentionally in a clinical way, or whether that's something that we apply to our general understanding so that we can be more intentional in our day-to-day activities and how they might support our health and well-being.
I think that, so at the event that I met you is an example of me kind of trying to tiptoe my way into understanding what's being done in this space of arts and health, or, neuroarts, these kind of related fields that are kind of trying to take an understanding of the neuroscience for how aesthetic experiences or experiences with the arts affect the brain and apply them. And so I think there's a lot of interesting ideas out there, and there's a lot of, there's for some types of mechanisms, I think there's a good amount of evidence. For others, we have less. What I'm really kind of trying to focus my efforts on is how can these more basic mechanisms that I've been looking at, so the pleasure we get from the experience, the meaning that we make from the experience, what role do those things play? Because clearly there's other ways that the arts can also help us, right? So music can clearly be beneficial in the context of rehabilitation, because it really, engages, rhythm, and and you can entrain, same with dance, right? It's physical movement, it's community, it's social. So there's all kinds of things there. But I think that my interest is in understanding, okay, what about these like fundamental mechanisms here are also really playing a role? And so I think that there are, I think we still are in early days of figuring out how this might work. But it is the case that we see that, first of all, there is some evidence that engaging with art forms can improve mood and improve well-being. And we've done a little bit of work. So with my co-author, Mackenzie Troop, we did a study where had people interact with an online art experience, and
Mm.
we measured the degree to which that online art experience improved their mood and improved various measures of, for example, like positive and negative affect, and reported anxiety, and we found there were positive changes in those markers. And then we specifically asked to what degree were those positive changes mediated by the liking and the meaning that they made from the experience, and we found that they were significantly mediated by those factors. So it seems like the meaning that you're making and the pleasure that you're getting really do play a strong role in the potential benefits there. I think that's one area. I think there's some other areas that I'm really interested in exploring, but that I don't think we have a lot of evidence for. So in the world of empirical aesthetics, it's often highlighted that when we approach something as an art object, we do this thing where we kind of disconnect our typical responses from the experience that we might have if it were real, if it were not in an aesthetic context. So if you imagine watching a play of a scene of domestic violence, you it may feel uncomfortable for you, but you will sit there and watch it. But if you saw the same thing on the street, you would likely intervene. I would hope you might intervene, right? And so, you know, we recognize that something is pretend or something is play by putting a frame around it, and we can experience those feelings without necessarily needing to act on them. And I think it's called kind of like an aesthetic frame or aesthetic distance is one way that people talk about that. And you know, there's some controversy in this idea, because it's clear that, you know, it's not the case that we have no motivation or action tendencies in response to art. We can want to approach something or want to interact with something, or we can feel kind of like emotionally, you know, disturbed. But, you know, there is this recognition that things are a little different when you put a frame around something. And so I think that art therapists have known this for a very long time and are very good at using that frame to help people kind of try to reframe or reappraise an experience from their own life. And so I think that we know that this works in a lot of contexts, that you know, having a person work with clay or work with dance or work with whatever to revisit a particular, for example, a traumatic incident in their past life that maybe they can't address head on, that maybe through the arts they can find a way to approach or chip away at the edge of that experience in a way which is less triggering for them, in a way which is a bit more abstract, and might allow them to move through a place of understanding. You know, so I think that we're really in early days of exactly understanding how it is that these types of kind of epistemic trajectories that we can take with the help of the arts and with the help of this pleasure that we might get from the act of understanding could be put towards use in particular contexts, in arts and health contexts.
As you're saying the framing, it's very true, and I've definitely experienced that in therapeutic settings of being invited to consider and kind of distance yourself from the experience. So almost like intentionally creating that separation from an experience so that you can look at it perhaps objectively, but also without that overwhelm of that affective feedback that you might be getting from that experience
Mhm.
being too close to yourself. So it feels almost like a distancing where you are able to perceive it as an external representation, whether it's a film or a play, as opposed to
Mhm.
one that is affecting you personally. So that's fascinating to understand some of those, and I would be curious to learn about them. Um, I I I know that we're kind of coming up on time, so I had one more question actually, and I'm wondering if we might maybe squeeze it in really quickly. So one of your other research studies, you had looked at um, how engaging in an aesthetic experience allowed for if an artwork allowed for being moved or being inspired and motivated to creative writing. So I wondered if you don't mind if we
Mhm.
could speak
Mhm.
about that because I'm fascinated in that multimodality. So from what I understood in the study, you were perceiving something that was a visual stimulus, a visual artwork, but then that somehow then translated into another medium, an output that was generated by the individual who was perceiving in a creative writing situation. So I'm curious if you might present that model and what you discovered.
Sure. So this was a behavioral study, but it was partly motivated by some brain imaging work that I've done, which we really haven't discussed so much in this particular call yet. So one of the things that we've found is that when a person is aesthetically moved by a piece of visual art, that there's a brain system called the default mode network, and this brain system is typically in kind of broader cognitive neuroscience thought of as a network that is more internally oriented. So it typically is not really engaged by stuff outside in the world. But we found that when someone is aesthetically moved by art, that it seems to engage not only your externally focused visual systems, perceptual systems, but also engages this internally focused default mode network. And so we're still kind of trying to understand what this means, but I think that what happens is that we see this large scale, this change in the connectivity and activity of large scale brain networks. And in these moments, well, we don't exactly know what's happening, but it's clear that these moments are kind of rare brain states that are high energetic brain states, and that it seemed, I think, to be important for us being able to integrate lots of different information from our internal state and from the external world to kind of have these like aha moments of sense reduction. And the default mode network has actually been specifically aligned kind of with the sense of self in some ways, or with kind of self-identity or the self-construct. And so it may be the case that when we do this with art, that we're really kind of like engaging the self. And so when thinking about this process and what it feels like to kind of like be moved, in these more extreme cases, we can sometimes be kind of kicked into a state where we feel like the wheels are turning, we're savoring, we're chewing on something, and you can kind of like almost feel that like a lot of your brain is really active and kind of like trying to puzzle through something, and you might even kind of feel like, metaphorically, that you're kind of seeing through the clouds, that you're kind of starting to get kind of like an idea of something new on the horizon, or some different way of seeing of yourself or seeing your relationship to the world. And of course, that may be only in the extremely rare circumstances, and most instances with art are much more mild. But I think that I had an intuition that felt very similar to these moments when we are creatively inspired. I have personally not done much work in the field of creativity, but I'm kind of trying to tiptoe into them. And I think that one of the difficulties of studying creativity is that it's not just one process or one moment. It really is a very complex, multi-processed, thing where we go through phases of ideation, of generating ideas, and then evaluating those ideas, and then trying to implement them. And so we've kind of focused on this idea of moments of creative inspiration, which there may not just be one in a creative process. You may have iterations of them, but there are these moments where you go from kind of like ideation, brainstorming to like, actually that one's might work. That one's a pretty good one. And then you switch over to this actualization, trying to kind of like think through it or work through it. And so they both of these kind of brain states feel like they're a bit elevated, that they're evoked by an external object, that there's kind of like this, there's like a bit of a motivational component to them. So we kind of wondered if there might be a link between them. So in this particular study, the idea was to take the type of paradigm we've used before, where we show people visual artwork and we ask them to tell us which ones are moving or not. And then we take the artworks that they rate as having high aesthetic appeal. And then we take the artworks that they rate as having low aesthetic appeal. And now we use them as prompts in a little creative writing task. And this is the kind of thing that if you were to go to a writing workshop, you might do, where you see a prompt and then you have 3 minutes to write like a little short vignette, right? So you're not going to be able to write an entire short story. Really, it's just about forcing you to come up with an idea quickly and kind of try to initially jot it down. And so what we were really interested in is in that moment after you see the prompt and you have 10 seconds before you have to start writing or something like that. On some trials, you're going to come up with good ideas, and on other trials, you're going to come up with not so good ideas, but then you're going to have to just pick one and go with it, right? And so sometimes you're like, that's cool, I've got a good idea, and you start writing something down, and again, in 3 minutes, you're not generating a very good story. But what we really care about is to then, after that writing period, to have you go back and tell us, did you feel inspired during that initial ideation phase or not? And so what we found is that people reported feeling more inspired when the prompt was an aesthetically appealing artwork for them. And so the idea was that we could this I think provides some initial evidence that you can actually prime a state of creative inspiration through the state of being moved. And it's not always the case that people's favorite stories and most inspiring prompts were those that are aesthetically moved, but we could definitely move the needle. We could increase the likelihood. And so, I think this points to for example, in educational context, a very basic lesson, which is that people are maybe more likely to find creative inspiration when you let them kind of choose their own prompts in a way, right? Find the thing that is interesting to them. And then that is more like, they're maybe more likely to be able to kind of like have, get into that space that allows them to get creative inspiration.
I absolutely love that. And I would love to see, I realize that right now we don't have the ability to be quite as specific with like portable EEGs as we can with fMRIs, but I would love to be able to see what are some of the flows of networks that are engaged when we go into these exchanges. But I think we will have to save that for another conversation because we're coming up on the end of our time today. I think you've kind of mentioned this a little bit, so I'll finish maybe with just two more questions if you don't mind. The first one is, as somebody who has been active in the field of neuroaesthetics, and increasingly more so in the field of arts and health, what do you see personally, or perhaps more holistically, as exciting trends in the future of arts and health advocacy, research, and practice? What do you see as the future of the field, and what do you think needs to grow, or where should we be heading
Mhm.
where we currently?
Yeah, I guess I'll try to highlight two things, and perhaps they both of my comments are kind of coming from my place as a computationally minded experimental scientist. So first, in the field of in neuroaesthetics, one thing I think is exciting is that we're getting to a place where people are starting to be able to actually create more explicit models and test those models against each other. So we're moving from a place of more kind of word-based, hand-wavy models to, like, write it down as an equation or implement it as a machine learning model and then come up with predictions and test them. So that's actually a really good sign that the field has matured to a point that our ideas can be formalized and tested. So I think that's bodes well for kind of a period of really improved understanding and model comparison. And then when it comes to the application to arts and health, I think I'm seeing, there's a lot of discussion and talk right now about how good is the evidence, what do we need to do to improve the evidence. And my sense is that at the very least, the field is, coming to terms with the fact that there are some interesting questions that we need more evidence for. Of course, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of us feel kind of the intuitive appeal of the arts in the health and well-being sphere. But, we need to be careful to not oversell the potential benefits before we actually have a solid evidence base. And that we need some of that evidence both in the more basic research field that I might currently work in, as well as in the more applied, right? So what types of interventions, what types of things actually make a difference? How much can we attribute those to just the social action versus the, whatever versus, the actual art experience itself. So I think that really, and we're in an exciting place where I think that we're kind of trying to find that overlap in language and in understanding between people who are actually doing this work, like, yourself, who are working in the field with patients and with people who might benefit from these experiences, and people like me who are good at designing, perhaps not very exciting experimental designs, but that give you interpretable outcomes. So how do you mesh these two worlds to be able to, actually create an evidence base that is useful for future future planning and future design in the field. And I think we're seeing some traction there. And most importantly, perhaps, we're starting to see some money coming into the field to help do those difficult and expensive experiments. And I hope we see more.
I agree with you, and you've echoed something that has come up repeatedly in our conversations on this podcast. And I think I'll be explicit about the fact that that was an intention of mine. I wanted to have this podcast because I perceive that what you just mentioned is absolutely integral for the growth of the field, for us across these different spectrums of this discipline, for us to come together and to have more clearer paths of understanding and exchange, because it's doesn't serve us well if we only have practice or only have computational analysis that helps us unpack it. We need to find a way for those two to have a path of conversation that influences
Mhm.
perhaps and reinforces what it is that we're doing, which, as you've mentioned today, also helps us be motivated to do it more. Okay, one final question, and then I know that you've got a very busy day. So we always ask our guests to share something personal, and to make this a little bit more comfortable, because I know not everybody wants to be very personal in a public forum. I'll give a little caveat. So we ask our guests to share a personal experience of the impact of dance or the arts in their lives. So maybe to consider, is there an experience that you've either experienced yourself or that you've witnessed that has helped you feel the magic of dance or the arts on health and well-being?
Sure. As you have gathered, my work is primarily focused on visual aesthetics. I think in my personal life, I am fascinated by art and visual aesthetics, but I also am very much a music person, and dancing is definitely a passion of mine. So I think it's most definitely the case that I have had, you know, uh, definitely my fair share of kind of ecstatic dance floor moments. I think I'm a person where my musical tastes tend toward really rhythmically complex, uh, beat driven, dance music, in deserts and warehouses and things like that, where I can really let go for hours. And so that those are moments which most definitely I've had, some just amazing experiences, and I've come to realize that actually that it's a key part of my own health and well-being, that I need to have those moments of being able to let go and just get into my body, to really, feel okay, over the long term. So,
Thank
yeah.
you for sharing that. And I feel like I might need to connect you with another one of our guests, Dr. Adolfo Garcia, who's a brilliant neurolinguist who is also an incredible guitarist. Hearing you speak right now just made me think of his relationship to music. I wonder if the two of you came
Uh,
together, you might discover something novel. Um, I just want to thank you one more time. I love talking with you because it pushes against my understanding and it pushes me over the edge of what I'm comfortable with. So I appreciate you for helping stimulate my own brain health today, but also introducing this fascinating topic to our audience. I hope that we can have another conversation at some point because I know that there's so much more to learn from the brilliant work that you do. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up today?
I think that's it. Yeah, I appreciate the chance to get to talk to your audience about this work, and look forward to seeing you more and talking more.
Thank you. Thanks so much. This episode of Dancing into Brain Health was edited and produced by me, Magda Kaczmarska, and Hilary Brown-Estreffi. The music for this show is the title cut from the album Critical Path by Joe Venegoni and Carl Weingarten. Show notes, links, and resources from today's episode can be found on the Dancing into Brain Health page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.